Thank you for having me. It's quite an exceptional list of things we're going to talk about, it sounds like. So, yes, my name is Ruben. I'm a scientist, I suppose, both in terms of third-person methods, but also a scientist when it comes to, I think, direct experience and introspection. And so, like you, I think I'm interested in this marriage between experience and science and the tools that we have there. And so, in the scientific field, my interest is in really, I suppose, how minds can transform. And I learned early on in my life that insight experiences seem to mark important transformations in our life. So when we have an inside experience, it allows us to see the world from a new perspective. And this, of course, means that something has changed within the mind, and understanding what has changed, why it changes, and how that affects the way that we see the world is something that interests me very much, both from the perspective of true insights, in the sense of adaptive and valuable insights that allow us to move forward in a wise and compassionate way, but also maladaptive insights, so delusions, psychotic experiences, and so on. Um, and within this, I'm very interested in meditation, because meditation is in a way a tool for us to gain insight into how our mind works, how the mind constructs experience, but from the inside perspective. Um, and also, meditation as a way of understanding the construction of experience, but also how to become a better person, I suppose, and how to serve the world. So it's really how these insights transfer to action. I suppose that's important. And if you can't really talk about change in the mind without talking about psychedelics in this day and age. So this is also very central to my research at the moment, because psychedelics seem to offer moments of profound plasticity that elicit a lot of insights, a lot of powerful insights. And that these insights seem to be one of the best predictors of therapeutic change and transformation as a consequence of psychedelics. So all of this, of course, comes under this general banner of interest around consciousness and simply, what is true and what is real within our experience and in the world. That's a deep place to start. I suppose I'll start by just beginning with, I suppose, the leading theory currently within cognitive neuroscience, which is this idea that the brain is in a way a prediction machine, or really not even just the brain, but the whole organism. Um, and so the key in understanding it as a prediction machine is that we're not actually taking in the world in this sort of passive way, the way that you would imagine that a camera takes in the information from the world and records it. Instead, the proposal is that we generate this vision of the world from within. That is, this moment, everything around us and our direct experience, but also the thoughts in our mind, but also the sense of self and even perception itself, is a construct derived from past experience, our past conditioning, in order to generate a practical model of this moment. So you can see why this is at least partly true. And that is because if we were actually seeing what our sensory apparatus was receiving, which is just a two-dimensional continuous stream of sensory data, we would be seeing flashes of light, for example, with the eyes, or we would be perceiving this sort of impressions on our bodies, but that's just these direct impressions. Or we would be hearing just the sound waves themselves in some sort of direct way. But that's not the case. We actually experience this sort of coherent, three-dimensional, multifaceted, connected, and uniform and coherent model. So this means that the brain has to, in a way, generate it. It's not possible um, uh, that we're just receiving that model, because our sensory apparatus is receiving two-dimensional information, and it's all coming in at different times. So the visual information is coming at a different time from the auditory information and the tactile information, as well as the information that makes up the body. So this implies that we are somehow constructing this moment. We are constructing this three-dimensional generative model of reality. Now, this is also clearly demonstrable through the lens of illusions, right? So as scientists, we've gotten really good at generating illusions in the visual domain, in the auditory domain, and in the tactile domain. Doesn't matter which domain you go into, we're able to generate illusions where you could say kind of false insight occurs and we have a mistake in our model, right? And this demonstrates that we not only are generating a model, but that we can manipulate that model, and that model can break down and go wrong in all sorts of ways. And there's many interesting things that kind of flow out from that, and interesting questions that you brought up as well. So one question is how does this actually connect to some sort of objective reality? Now, we don't know what is outside our sensory apparatus. No one's ever accessed anything outside of their conscious experience. Even in the scientific domain, in a way, we are accessing a kind of shared metacognition, a shared kind of consistency in reality, but no one has ever been able to step outside conscious experience. So we remain kind of in this process of trying to infer what's outside of our own conscious experience, but we're doing that inference within conscious experience. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't something beyond the body and beyond the brain and beyond our sort of shared conscious experience, but it means that we were never able to get there directly. And that there is something fundamentally co-constructive about at least how we perceive, because we know culture plays a powerful role. We know that other people's opinions and perceptions play a powerful role in driving how we perceive the world. So there's this sort of way in which we're all kind of nodes in a complex network with models of reality that we're sharing with each other and using each other's models to infer our own. And so there's this interesting way that these things all tie together. Now, if we think also about meditation, this is interesting to think that what we perceive is our own generation, is the system's own model, which in a way means that we may have more agency over that model than we might believe. Because if we were directly just receiving this sort of wisdom from the world, then we may not be able to access how it's constructed. We may not be able to come to understand from a first person perspective that reality. But if it's being generated from within, then there's this possibility that we're actually able to make sense of that model from within, if that makes sense. So that's already a lot of little things, and I'll stop there so that to hear your thoughts. Yeah. Another really good and deep question. You bring in lots of ideas that I really like around autopoiesis and umwelt and the gestalt of experience. All really important. And so you highlight in a way, I guess, what comes to mind to me in this question is this empathy gap. This how can we possibly transfer this internally generated model of reality across beings, especially if those beings have a fundamentally different um, uh, biological organism, right? Like animals or even artificial intelligence, as we're kind of having to deal with more and more. And I don't think there's an easy question an easy answer to this question, but I will say that I think there are constructs that might help us deal with both the empathy gap, but also the gap between our model and reality, because really it's the same problem, that the idea that there's this reality outside of us and that there's this gap in our inability to directly access it. In the same way, there's other people and other organisms and other beings, and there's this seems to be this gap between us and them, and it's very difficult to bridge. And I think again the clearly our generative models can go wrong. So clearly we have issues with this empathy thing, and we can see this in the world, right? Where we have extreme difficulties in understanding other people's models from other cultures, other political persuasions, and so on. So there's obvious an inferential process here that can go really wrong. But there are constructs like, for example, synchrony. that may give us some hope around actually finding some, and to use a related concept, a resonance between different models and ways of looking at reality and each other. So that there's a potentially, and this is kind of going into the speculative domain, because I think this is a kind of fundamental epistemic sort of metaphysical challenge in science to try to bridge this gap. But I think we all have the sense, for instance, to kind of ground this, that if we listen actively, if we really listen, if we bring ourselves into the present moment and really make contact with that which we're interacting, whether it's a person or a plant or an animal, that we receive some new information. We start to make sense of this person or this plant or this place, and we start to perhaps even mirror them in a way that gets us close to their model. So people who spend more time together start to be more similar, right? There's some sort of sharing of information. This is not one way. So it's not this model being transferred to that model, but it's actually these generative models sort of interacting with each other like kind of oscillators and resonating. And through that resonance and coherence, slowly finding potentially some harmony, some consistency, some fluent sharing of information that actually allows them to not only understand each other, but actually become, in a way, intertwined in such a way that the models start to reflect each other. So there's a mirroring kind of process that can happen. And because although there is this generative model that we're building from within, we are continuous with each other in a kind of fundamental information theoretic sense, right? We are, through the lens of the body and through the world and through our actions, extremely connected to each other and influencing each other in very direct ways. So even though the generative models are indirectly connected, there is a direct sort of informational dynamic relationship between all beings and the world and plants and so on. And so the more that these things interact with each other in such a way that we get out of our abstract models, that we get out of these sort of existing priors and beliefs and more in touch with the present moment, and the more these two kind of organisms that are increasingly in touch with the present moment are resonating with each other, to that extent, information, I think, can be shared in a relatively direct way, and that this resonance can then give rise to worldviews that are comprehensible to each other. And that is why I think we can communicate and understand each other and make sense. And it's through this shared information, through this communication, and in particular, this coming into contact with the present moment as much as possible, that resonance and understanding can be found. So in a way, the story I'm trying to say is that there is hope for more understanding of each other and more understanding of living organisms. And yet there is also a lot of opportunity for that to go wrong. And it requires a kind of intent and desire for understanding to make that actually possible. I think we need to be quite humble, I suppose, and open to the possibility that the objects that we believe we're perceiving don't don't really exist, at least in the way that we perceive them. Now, there's different ways to get to this. You can get to this scientifically, so you can get to it experimentally and show in many ways that the objects that we're interacting with don't show up in perception the way that they actually are. So there's many examples of this in illusions and so on. But there's another way that we can get to this, which is a bit more metaphysical, a bit more philosophical, but also experiential. And that is, for example, through the lens of what Buddhists call emptiness. But there's also a scientific kind of way to get at this idea that the objects of our perception are not how we perceive them to be, which is to understand that all categories, all objects of perception, all so-called things are are in a sense constructs of the mind. And the reason for this is that objects in the world are actually continuous in some fundamental sense. So if you can take something like a tree, and you can see that, okay, for us, we can see some sort of delineation, some important delineation seemingly through our perception between, I'm looking at a tree here in front of me, between the leaves and the atmosphere, or we can imagine the delineation between the roots and the earth. But I think if we zoomed in to where we perceive those delineations, what we would ultimately see is continuity. So that's one way we can start to perhaps imagine that the apparent distinctions between things in the world, although adaptive and functional for us as living organisms, may not exist in such a rigid way as we imagine them to be. We can take other examples, and these are really come up often in cognitive science. And in philosophy, this is called the problem of ambiguity or vagueness, rather. And you have various paradoxes that demonstrate this, like the Socrates paradox, which relates this idea that, for example, if you have a heap of sand, how many grains of sand do you need to remove from that heap for it to no longer be a heap? Or how many grains of sand do you need to apply or to combine for it to become a heap? Or the bald man paradox, at what point does, how many hairs do you have to lose to become bald? So this sort of vagueness between categories, a lot of people don't realize applies to basically everything. And so you can take something like chairs and tables. There's chairs from which we could sit down and eat. There's chairs without a backrest, and there's tables that we sit on, and so on. And so if you zoom in into the apparent rules of any objects and categories in the world, this sort of natural kind of categories assumption breaks down, and what we actually see is a kind of continuity, or at best, we see overlapping kind of distributions of characteristics. So these kinds of, I think, facts, or questions or paradoxes, I think, reveal to us that the reference, the thing that we're actually trying to understand, does not exist in the way that we think it does, except from our perspective. You need a particular kind of perspective to have a particular kind of object. And so you can imagine an alien that inhabits the same world but has a completely different sensory apparatus that would infer different kinds of objects into existence. If they have a different kind of body, if they're a different kind of size, and so the affordances of their perception are going to be different. And so in this way, I think we need to, I suppose, be humble about the existence of the referent in some sort of way that isn't serving our adaptive functioning, which I think it does. And so we need to take them to be real in our actions, because that's what allows us to survive. But from a philosophical, metaphysical, but also sort of deep experiential perspective, I think these objects don't exist. And the same sort of logic can be applied to the self as well. I I think one question is pragmatic. Which view of reality is more beautiful? I think this is an interesting question. And there's, of course, a certain physical benefit to having a more beautiful model of reality that may also even have implications on whether we interpret it to be true. Now, there may also be a middle way to these two kind of, both in a way, dualistic understandings of reality. I mean, again, we can kind of exaggerate them and just say, on one side, subjective experience, consciousness is primary, and on the other side, these sorts of inanimate objects are primary. And also from the East and the West, you get different sort of versions of more holistic sort of interactive, dynamic views of reality versus atomized kind of balls interacting and causing each other to go in various ways, whether that's atoms or protons or however far you want to zoom down. And if you look at this experientially, I think both are convincing, but neither really stand up to testing. I think it's from the Western perspective, I think it's quite clear that we've underestimated the power of subjective experience and the power of consciousness in the sort of unfolding of physics and quantum mechanics, but also the importance of experience in determining how the brain and mind changes, and the kind of top-down influence of subjective experience on physical reality. That is our sort of physiology, for instance, but also our perceptions and the impact of our beliefs on the reality of that unfolds through our actions in the world. So there's clearly this clearly subjective experience is really important in the process of constructing a world model, but also then constructing the world. As you say, we kind of develop our niches in our world. So subjective experience is underappreciated, I would say, in the West. But just the same, we can see by our technological developments and the progress of science and so on, that perhaps the sort of more atomistic, disembodied third person perspective on reality is also powerful, because it lets us get at this sort of to narrow in on the shared consistent features of our world. So this atomistic view is also really powerful. And so you can see that there's strengths and limitations to both worldviews, and it may be appropriate to take one on in certain sort of tasks and the other in other tasks, or there may be a way in which we can hold both of them somewhat lightly. For example, we may recognize that although consciousness and subjective experience is extremely fundamental, is extremely powerful, is very close or even right at this sort of heart of how the universe constructs itself, we can also still perhaps suggest that consciousness is still constructed. That even if awareness, in an experiential sense, appears to be the most basic, necessary component of all reality, and we can even have these experiences of pure awareness and so on, you can also have events where this awareness breaks down, and you can still recognize that there is a codependence between all objects of experience, just as there is a codependence, a kind of interdependence between all objects in science. So I think we haven't yet, we don't yet have a good articulation of what that sort of third option of a worldview might be, that sort of steps out of this dualistic frame of subjective experience versus objects of the world. But I think that there is such a way of being, that there is such a worldview. And I do think that in some cases, some framings of, for example, the Buddhist worldview do get at this kind of non-dualistic way of seeing the world. I like that you lumped in things like meaning and self, because I do think it's a similar process, and I think it lies in what is the function of these feelings and these ideas, because the self is both a feeling and a story. It's both a sensation and a narrative at different levels of our being, really. And the same is true for meaning. The meaning is a kind of experience. We feel when something is meaningful. We feel when something is important to us, when something is valuable. And similarly, we feel a sense of self. We feel that we are. I feel that I am. And I have a story about myself in the past and in the future. And I think it doesn't reduce these feelings to recognize that they are in a way constructed out of something that potentially, something that is beyond meaning or beyond self. So I won't say that that which lies behind our personal experience of self and personal experience of meaning is meaningless. That seems like an attribution that a self would make. That seems like an attribution that a meaning-making organism would make. But beyond meaning, beyond self, is something prior to or irrelevant to the self, or irrelevant to meaning, or earlier than in the kind of constructive process. So now kind of from the neuroscience perspective, there's a process of, I think, abstraction that happens. There's a kind of sensory experience that we model into increasingly abstract time-based models. And in that process of inferring our body and inferring our body in next moments in time, we have a self. Because in order to act in the world at all, in order for me to pick up this cup, I have to have a model of myself, because I need to be able to have a model of myself in order to move my hands, to generate the kinds of actions in order to pick up that cup and drink it. Already requires a model not only of my body, but of the homeostatic functioning of the whole system and the needs of the system in order to drink and so on. So a model of the body is necessary simply to exist, simply to make any kinds of movements in reality. And then you can see how from that very simple sort of interoceptive physical model of our body, in time, we start to develop an increasingly abstract and coherent and meaningful sense of who we are, which includes the sort of narrative self, and further in time, because once you extend the body in time, you need a story to connect that body in time. And so from that, we get the past, we get the present, and the future, which is the body in the past and the present and the future, and our stories about it. And then we ascribe some consistency to that body over time. And from that, we get this abstract sense of a self and our story. And then we can, in a similar way, construct meaning. What is meaningful to that body and that narrative over time? And so in a way, meaning is an even higher level construct that we lay on top of the self, the embodied and the narrative self, to see what's important to that unfolding agent in reality. That would be my sort of description of how that unfolds. But I think the kind of valuable recognition, I think, is not that there's some meaningless stuff in reality that's giving rise to self and meaning, but that there's something beyond these meaning and self, beyond even the idea of meaning and self or no self, or these dichotomies that are only relevant in the domain of an abstracting agent who constructs ideas of meaning and self, and so on. I think it's tempting to make dichotomies, and this is how science and comprehension has in a way progressed. It's by drawing lines between things. And so it's tempting to do that also between, for example, the unconscious and the conscious mind. It's tempting to say that there's some sort of clear boundary between these two, in the same sense that we want to imagine that there's a clear boundary between the leaves of a tree and the roots and the earth, and a clear boundary between chairs and tables and so on. But I think the reality is that there is a continuity. And this can be applied to, for example, Daniel Kahneman's view of system one and system two, to kind of take a contemporary lens on this. We may have this intuition that there is a very clear difference between unconscious processes that in a way happen to us, that are automatic, that are effortless, and are sort of the stuff of dreams and the stuff of spontaneous imagination, the stuff of spontaneous ideas. And then this other part of us that is really controlled and linear and analytic, and makes sense of reality in terms of stories and coherent logic in a way. But I think what we learn from, for example, the active inference approach and contemporary vision of the mind and the brain is that it's more like a hierarchy, more like this multi-layered, very complicated system of inference where there's earlier stages of construction that are perhaps unconscious and that draw on these sorts of associative, highly complex mechanisms of putting together a narrative that the narrative can never actually make sense of. Because a narrative is by definition, the sort of conscious, coherent, logic-based narrative is by definition a very tiny slice, a very tiny emergent property of something that is much more vast, much more associative, much more complicated than a kind of simple story, a simple kind of coherent model could possibly hold together. And that's an issue of resource limitation within the human brain, right? We're limited in the amount of information that we can hold at once. And so the kind of complex, associative, unconscious sort of dream machine unfolding below consciousness is something that we can't quite grasp, and is not something that is discontinuous, but is something that is, I think, a multi-layered process of inference that we can even become more conscious of potentially. So I think we can, through, for example, practices of meditation, become more aware and more conscious of the early stages of construction in the mind. And in that sense, I do think we have some access to what might be the unconscious processes that give rise to our experience. But this requires us to slow down, let go of this sort of time-based narrative in which we're sort of embedded for the purposes of adaptive action, and sort of narrow that time lens back into the present, and then sink down and observe the process of construction in the mind. And as we do that, I actually do think that we become aware of the unconscious mind to a greater extent, and that we begin to integrate this unconscious wisdom, let's say, into our working model, and we become more self-aware about how we ourselves come into being. We can never fully access it, because in a way there's already this thing that's aware and this thing that we're being aware of, and this thing can only become if this thing were to become aware of that, then it would need to also become aware of itself. And so you get this recursion issue that unfolds there, that you can't really ever be fully self-aware, but you can become more self-aware, and in that, through that self-awareness, perhaps find some freedom and some extra meaning, some extra agency, and happiness, perhaps. These are really special questions. I'm really appreciating it. It's getting me to think about some profound ways, and I've profound things, and I've never thought about this prospect that the immoral behavior that we may observe among some contemplatives and some who have perhaps some insight into themselves or how the mind works, could be actually a kind of neurological response to those insights, or a consequence. Like I guess what you're getting at here is that there's this sort of like overly flexible system that emerges that perhaps even makes it a little bit impulsive, or a little bit sort of or at least stands outside our existing moral frameworks that are perhaps more linear and more logical and more rigid, and that's how we would like them to be. But perhaps they're not. Now, I suppose one assumption in there that I want to address first is that there's probably an open question about whether the base rates of, let's say, gurus committing certain immoral acts is higher than the base rates of the general population or any other spiritual tradition. I suspect that, and then from the little work I've seen on this, I think the base rates are not that different. I think there's probably something unique generally about authority and sort of unfiltered power in any community that is corrupting potentially, and which itself makes one prone to do immoral things or take advantage of others, just because that capacity to take advantage of others is clearly available for those people and is not available to the average person. And so it's hard to say whether it's a consequence of that as opposed to the insights themselves. But I think it's an intriguing idea, and I don't think, what I will say is that I don't think the deep transformations and insights that can unfold through contemplative practice or psychedelics are without potential trade-offs, both in terms of our functioning and adaptive functioning, but also in our capacity to be empathetic to others. One example being, for example, the curse of knowledge. So we see this in teaching. So you can't have a 60-year-old quantum physicist who's at the cutting edge of, let's say, gravitational theory, trying to teach primary school students, because the curse of knowledge, the gap between the realities that these people inhabit, is so distant. You need people at different stages to allow communication to unfold. This links back to our questions about coherence and resonance, and the distance between two models. And they need a lot of time to resonate with each other, to find understanding and meaning, and this requires an openness, a kind of meeting the moment over and over and again. And so if you have two very different models meeting each other, this might be very hard. If you have a Buddha meeting Andrew Tate, you're going to have a difficult process of communication, because these are two very different models meeting each other, extremely egocentric on one side and sort of less egocentric on the other. And so there's distance that needs to be bridged, and that distance might get bigger as insight unfolds. Now, the kind of safety mechanism there is that ideally, if this sort of contemplative insight unfolds, there's a greater access, a greater flexibility towards the present. So ideally, what you would find is a faster responsiveness to the mistakes that one makes. Still, one is going to make mistakes. Still, you're going to have misinterpretations. You're still going to misunderstand other people, and you're still going to do immoral things. But perhaps this insight makes the system more flexible to change, more willing to respond to the moment. And if it's not responsive to the moment in this way, then I would say that the insight has not gone in the preferable direction. But you can also take this flexibility too far. So you can also have such flexibility that you flip over that fine line where you enter into a space of delusion and psychosis and misunderstanding. So this entropy, let's say, from the induction of psychedelics and the action on the 5-HT2A receptors, as you mentioned, and the flexibility that comes with that, can also be too far and can result in false insights, misunderstandings, and potentially a kind of delusional matrix. Because if our past experience constrains our interpretation of reality, because that past experience, in most cases, contains valuable information. So throwing away our past experience entirely is a recipe for delusion, because it doesn't make sense to try to construct each moment without everything that we've learned. In fact, there's a good reason to believe that that's impossible, because it would be akin to being a baby and not yet actually being able to construct a model of the world that allows you to act in it appropriately. Or to speak. You cannot put together a coherent sentence without a very complex degree of past experience informing that action. This one's a little bit easier for me, thank you. So we have a whole range of experimental ways in which we've elicited false insights. Again, we can step back and we can recognize that obviously there's many contradictory beliefs in the world, contradictory insights, and they can't all be true. And we know that there is schizophrenia and psychosis in these cases where insight obviously, the process of insight obviously breaks down. But what we've done in our scientific work is see if we can actually elicit these in the laboratory. And indeed, what we find is that if we manipulate the prior information using a process called priming, and then present a problem that we've primed you to have the wrong interpretation of this problem, you will come to a false insight. And so this is similar in the world. So if we've been misled by prior information, our education hasn't been good, or we've succumbed to propaganda or misinformation, then the insights that flow on from that misinformation are going to be, or are more likely to be, false. And we can demonstrate this in the lab very concretely. The other thing that we've done is not only show that the insight itself can arise to be false, and this is research that was led by a PhD student of mine, Hilary Grimmer, but there's another thing that we can do is we can elicit false insights, but we can also disentangle the experience of insight from our interpretation of what is true. And I'll unpack that in a second, but I'll begin this way by introducing an idea that we published last year, and that was kind of central to my PhD, which finished now many years ago. But it's the idea of the eureka heuristic, and this is the idea that we select ideas and thoughts and perspective from the stream of consciousness driven by this feeling of insight. That is, we're having this stream of consciousness. We have thoughts emerging in the mind. We have new perspectives emerging on the mind. I have your speech emerging in my mind, and I have to somehow select what I think is true and valuable and what I should pay attention to. So even my own stream of consciousness is a bit like your stream of consciousness within my consciousness, in the sense that I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's arising in my mind, and I don't know what's going to be true, and I don't know where it's coming from. And so the feeling of insight we propose is a heuristic way to select which ideas are likely to be true given what we've learned. So if you imagine that you're running away from a lion on the savannah, you don't have a time to stop and test your ideas with a cost-benefit analysis or to do a scientific experiment. You simply need to select which of those ideas are likely to be true. Right? And so insight we propose is a kind of light, like the light bulb, that highlights, brings attention to the ideas that are likely to be true so that we can select them for fast and efficient action in the world. Now, this heuristic can go wrong. So going back to the experiment, we can take this feeling of insight based on this theory. It would assume that if we elicited a feeling of insight and we presented some other information at exactly the same time, then we could make this information seem true, even if it's not. That is, we could use the heuristic of insight by eliciting an insight to make this information seem true, even if it's false. So that's exactly what we did. We presented people with facts and worldviews, and we've done this with many experiments now, with many replications and thousands of participants. And you can ask people to rate, for example, whether they think it's true that free will is an illusion. And if we elicit an insight at the same moment as we present them with that worldview statement, they are more likely to believe that it's true. And the same goes for facts. So I could say, do you think lithium is the lightest of all metals? And if I ask you this question at the same time, elicit an insight, you'll be more likely to say that it's true, even if it's actually false. So in this sense, I guess the punchline of this whole thing is that insight experience, like everything, like perception itself, is an inference the mind is making about what is likely to be true given past experience. And it allows us in a way to bring light to particular versions, particular perspectives on reality, and to use those perspectives efficiently out in the world. But what it highlights is that we need to hold our insights lightly. We need to have this meta-awareness, or develop this meta-awareness, to recognize when an insight can be trusted and when it cannot, and when we need to look further or deeper through, for example, scientific experimentation to find out what is actually true. As well as, enter into the dialogue between people where everyone is bringing their insights, and have those insights converse with each other and allow them to break down as well, and to not hold them too tightly, because again, that gets in the responsiveness to the present moment. A really underappreciated sort of almost assumption about both the nature of reality, but also the human organism, that it is fundamentally creative. That there's some essential nature of reality that is creative. I was thinking about this today, in fact, and I think in order to be creative, you first have to release the current version that you're holding of reality. And so from the predictive processing frame, you need to relax the model that you have. You need to relax your priors or your beliefs in order to enter this sort of process of regression, you could say, or emptying the bucket, right? In order for new vision to emerge. Right. So we have to, in a way, get out of the way in order to be genuinely creative. We need to get into contact with the moment. We need to get into conversation with reality. And we also need to give space to the existing information within us to prune itself, to restructure itself, to find a new, more parsimonious way of looking at reality. In predictive processing, this is called Bayesian reduction, where the system actually works its models against itself and slowly prunes to sculpt out the kind of key essential meaning from our past experience. And as we allow our existing models to let go, this sort of sculpting process, this kind of mind in the furnace of life can begin to unfold and bring out something more refined, something more precise. And as that more refined, more precise model based on our past experience meets the raw sensation of this moment of reality, a kind of conversation unfolds between our priors and the moment that gives rise to a natural kind of spontaneous creativity. And necessarily so, because the moment is always fresh, the moment is always new, and our priors are always there to meet it. And it's through this interaction of our priors and the moment that creativity unfolds. And mathematically, this is Bayesian inference, but it's fundamentally creative because it's always conversational. It's always a conversation between the known and the unknown. And in order for us to really get into that conversation, we do need to release the known. We need to step into this kind of regressive process that isn't actually regressive, but is actually stepping into the harmony of information in the world and letting go of our kind of contradictions and our rigidity, our stuckness. And in that, it's possible to create a space of creativity. And in fact, you're not creating a space of creativity because creativity is the nature of that process itself. It's fundamentally creative, even from like a Bayesian mathematical perspective. But it's obviously creative because we can see that one of the main things that humans do is create new worlds, new realities, technology, art, science. Even science is creative because those insights, those ideas for our experiments and our theories come from that creative process. They don't ultimately come from just the rational sort of linear process, which is extremely important for informing this conversation with the moment. But ultimately, the new creativity comes as a function of just the natural creativity, I think, of the universe itself. Us as expressions of that creativity and continuing that creative process that was birthed at the beginning of creation, really. Beautiful question. Thank you.